January 17, 1940. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. It was a morning wrapped in frost. The kind of cold that silences birds and sharpens every sound. Somewhere inside the great hall of a quiet English estate, a clock ticked. Its rhythm was ordinary, but within its steady pulse lay the secret tempo of a world at war. Each second marked a loss somewhere beyond the horizon. A ship sunk in the Atlantic, a town under occupation, a life extinguished in the dark. Time was bleeding, and no one could stop it. Bletchley Park, a once graceful Victorian mansion, now stood transformed. What had been a family home was turning into the beating heart of Britain's secret war. Around its lawns, wooden huts were being raised hastily, plain, drafty buildings where some of the brightest minds in the country would soon work in silence. To any passer-by, the estate seemed almost peaceful. The windows glowed faintly through the mist. Gardeners trimmed hedges under the watch of uniformed guards. A bicycle leaned against a gatepost. It was an image of English calm. Yet, behind those doors, an invisible storm had begun. The war in Europe was only months old, but already it had consumed nations. Poland had fallen. Norway trembled. France prepared for the blow everyone knew was coming. And Britain, alone across the narrow sea, stood defiant but blind. German bombers struck with precision. U-boats haunted the ocean routes like sharks in black water. The British Admiralty could see the pattern of destruction, but not the plan behind it. Orders, coordinates, and timings were being transmitted through the air every hour. Messages no one could read. At the center of this mystery stood a small black box, polished and unassuming, the Enigma machine. To the German military, it was perfection made mechanical. A cipher system so intricate that even if one had the machine, without the exact daily key, its message remained pure nonsense. Each keystroke transformed a letter into another, the pattern shifting every time, creating more possible combinations than there were stars visible to the human eye. The Germans called it unbreakable. They believed it was the perfect armor for their empire of steel. But the clock at Bletchley Park kept ticking, as if in quiet defiance. For in one of the estate's side rooms, among maps and stacks of intercepted radio chatter, a handful of British mathematicians and linguists were beginning to ask a forbidden question. What if the unbreakable could be broken? Among them was a man of peculiar manner and unmatched intellect, Alan Turing. Cambridge-trained, socially awkward, quietly stubborn, he arrived at Bletchley not as a soldier but as something rarer, a thinker unafraid of impossibility. Turing did not see Enigma as a fortress. He saw it as a puzzle, vast, intricate, but still bound by logic. And logic, he believed, could be taught to a machine. That idea, in 1940, was almost heretical. Machines added, subtracted, measured. They did not think. Yet Turing's vision was clear. Build a device that could imitate reasoning, one that could sift through countless Enigma settings in the time it would take a human to guess one. The ticking clock became his silent rival. Each second wasted meant another convoy attacked, another night raid unpredicted. Each dawn that came without progress meant the enemy had spoken freely for another day. Around him, Bletchley's staff began to grow. Cryptographers, language scholars, and crossword champions were summoned by telegrams so vague they could not guess why they'd been chosen. One invitation simply read, "You are invited to an interview in London regarding work of national importance." Most arrived unsure whether they were joining intelligence, the post office, or something in between. They came nonetheless, women and men of every kind. Some were professors, others typists. Some had studied Greek verbs or played violin, but all would soon share the same rhythm. The endless turning of rotors, the scribble of pencils, the pulse of the clock. As winter deepened, the first intercepted Enigma messages began to flow in. Lines of letters, Endless, meaningless. XKZ, RMW, JPL. It looked like madness, but to those inside Bletchley, it was not nonsense. It was the voice of the enemy, muffled but real, and they intended to listen. Turing worked relentlessly, building his design on paper first, a blueprint for a machine that would soon be called the bomb. He imagined drums turning in sequence, testing every logical path that Enigma could take, rejecting false leads automatically until only one remained. The others thought it audacious. He thought it necessary. Outside the estate, London shivered under blackout curtains. Across the Channel, German panzers rolled through frozen fields. The world seemed to march to a rhythm of chaos, but within Hut 8, another rhythm persisted. The clock. Its ticking reminded everyone why they were there. It cut through fatigue, doubt, and failure. Each sound said, "Time is the real enemy." The first prototypes of Turing's machine were crude. Switches sparked, wires tangled, calculations failed. Yet progress, though slow, was unstoppable. Each small success was measured not in cheers, but in silence. A nod, a mark on a page, a glance at the clock. Somewhere far away, in the cold North Sea, a German U-boat transmitted its position through Enigma. The message crossed the airwaves unseen, landing in Allied hands as a stream of nonsense. But for the first time, Bletchley had a weapon that could begin to make sense of it. And so the quiet battle continued. Logic against arrogance, time against secrecy. Britain's front line was no longer only the skies of Kent or the waters of the Atlantic. It was here, in a room lit by weak bulbs and fueled by tea and resolve, where men and women listened to the steady tick of a clock and refused to give in. Turing often stayed past midnight, long after the others had gone. He'd stand by the window, watching fog drift across the lawns, his mind still whirring like the machine he imagined. The clock on the wall struck 2. He did not move. To him, every tick was both promise and warning, the sound of time running out, but also the proof that time still existed to be fought for. Outside, the wind carried the muffled sound of train whistles and church bells. Life went on. No one in the nearby village guessed that within that quiet mansion, the balance of the entire war was beginning to shift. By dawn, frost had returned to the windows. The workers arrived by bicycle, breath clouding in the cold. The clock in the hall continued its calm beat. A small group of minds gathered in Hut 6, ready once again to wrestle with the impossible. And though they did not know it yet, that ticking clock, their constant reminder of what was slipping away, had already begun to mark a different kind of time. A countdown, not to defeat, but to discovery. A rhythm that would, before the war's end, outlast the roar of every bomb and the silence of every secret. The clock at Bletchley Park had begun to tick not just for Britain, but for the modern world itself. March 1940, Berlin and the North Atlantic. In the grand offices of Berlin, the air smelled of ink and certainty. Maps covered the walls, red lines stretching across Europe like veins of power. Everywhere, clocks ticked, synchronized, efficient, mechanical. The rhythm of an empire convinced it could not be stopped. At sea, beneath the gray Atlantic waves, U-boat crews waited for orders that came through the ether, encoded in letters and numbers that no Allied ear could interpret. Each transmission ended with a calm click of confidence. Each commander believed the same thing. Enigma cannot be broken. The German Navy had reason to believe in its own perfection. The Enigma machine, introduced to military service in the 1930s, was the masterpiece of modern cryptography, a compact cathedral of logic. 3 rotors turned with every keystroke, feeding electricity through a maze of circuits that transformed language into chaos. Each day, every unit of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine received a sheet of code settings, rotor positions, plug board pairs, ring settings, a ritual of precision that reset the unbreakable. Mathematically, it was untouchable. To guess one day's key by hand would take longer than the age of the universe. The Germans trusted their machine with the same faith they placed in their armies. But in London, the air smelled of smoke and worry. The British Isles, isolated and undersupplied, had become a fortress of hunger. Merchant ships, lifelines of food, oil, and weapons, vanished in the North Atlantic. Each week, more hulls split open under torpedoes, their cargo sinking into black water. By the spring of 1940, the sea itself seemed to turn hostile. Convoy after convoy disappeared without warning. In the first year of the war alone, more than 1,000 ships were lost. The Admiralty could not see the enemy, but it could feel him, a predator guided by invisible eyes. In the dim war rooms of Whitehall, a terrible question echoed. How do they always know where to strike? The answer pulsed in Berlin's confidence. The Kriegsmarine's U-boats, hunted by map coordinates transmitted through Enigma. Each message was a whisper of death, carried by the airwaves, open to anyone who could hear, but locked beyond comprehension. At Bletchley Park, that challenge had become an obsession. In the huts that now spread across the estate's grounds, mathematicians and linguists gathered daily before pages of intercepted radio traffic. Lines of code spilled from the machines of the wise service. Fragments of Enigma transmissions captured by listening posts along Britain's coast. It was a language of ghosts. Strings of letters like YQFZP, WMTLX, NRBJK. Each one a life-or-death decision hidden behind randomness. The workers at Bletchley had given up the comfort of clarity. They lived in puzzles now, and above them, the same mansion clock that had ticked in the frost of January continued its rhythm. Quiet. Relentless, impartial, Alan Turing sat in Hut 8, surrounded by notes, his hair unkempt, his clothes carelessly buttoned. What others saw as chaos, he saw as pattern. Every tick of the clock seemed to provoke him. Faster, faster, faster. He understood what few did, that Enigma, for all its power, was not divine. It was human, and humans were flawed. If a German operator repeated a word, or began his message the same way each morning, that habit could become the crack in an iron wall. He also knew the enemy's greatest weakness: routine. Every day at midnight, the German forces changed their Enigma settings. Each morning, the British intercepted new messages. Each day's intelligence window closed with the turning of the rotors and the steady tick of the clock. To win this race against midnight, Turing needed more than logic. He needed speed, mechanical speed. He envisioned a machine that could run through Enigma's countless combinations automatically, testing possibilities at a rate no human could match. The bomb, he called it, after the Polish cryptographic device that had inspired his work. But his version would be faster, more adaptable, capable of running through tens of thousands of rotor positions in a single session. It was a dream that sounded like madness to most engineers. To the War Office, it was a gamble made of wires and hope. To Turing, it was necessity. While Turing worked on his design, the Germans celebrated their dominance. In Berlin, Reich officials toasted their victories. The Atlantic was our sea again, they said. Unsinkable for us, unlivable for them. To them, Enigma was more than a machine. It was a symbol of intellectual superiority. It was the proof that order, German order, had triumphed over chaos. But arrogance, like time, always runs forward. The clock in Bletchley Park did not stop. By early summer, Turing's plans turned into reality. The first bombing machine was assembled in secret workshops at Letchworth, its frame a maze of wires and spinning drums. It stood taller than a man and wider than a desk, humming with electric potential. When it was switched on, the air filled with the sound of rotation, rotors spinning, circuits clicking, logic becoming movement. It was as if Turing's mind had taken form in steel. Yet the machine was not enough by itself. Each bomb needed a starting point, a hint of what the original message might contain. The Codebreakers called these hints cribs, sometimes a routine German phrase, sometimes a guess, like Heil Hitler or Wetterbericht, weather report. If a crib was correct, the bomb could test combinations around it until it found the exact key for that day. The first attempts failed, then failed again. Time slipped away. Tick, tick, tick. The U-boats continued to strike. The Germans continued to laugh. Then, one morning in May 1941, a captured German weather message offered the thread they needed. The bomb turned, slowed, stopped. The letters began to align. The first readable sentence emerged from the machine, a message meant for a German submarine commander. The unbreakable was broken. For a moment, no one spoke. They looked at the paper, at one another, then at the clock. Its ticking no longer sounded indifferent. It sounded like heartbeat, like time reclaimed. The British now possessed something far more powerful than luck: foresight. The ability to see the enemy's intentions before they unfolded. That day, a new kind of weapon was born, not of gunpowder or steel, but of patience, intellect, and time. The knowledge gleaned from that breakthrough would soon be called ultra. Intelligence so precise and so secret that even generals could not know its origin. But that revelation still lay ahead. For now, in the spring of 1940, Bletchley Park had achieved the impossible once. Tomorrow, the enemy would change their settings, and the race would begin again. As the staff left the hut for the night, Turing lingered by the doorway. The halls were empty now. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock in the mansion hall. Steady, patient, unstoppable. It marked not victory, not even relief. It marked the beginning of a war within the war, a contest between secrecy and persistence, arrogance and intellect. Across the sea, the Germans still believed their fortress of ciphers stood intact. But in one quiet corner of England, the first crack had formed. And through that crack, time itself began to slip through. The clock continued to tick, and with each beat, the distance between confidence and collapse grew smaller. The spring of 1941 arrived damp and grey. In London, fog clung to the Thames like a warning. Above the rooftops, barrage balloons drifted against a sky that never seemed to clear. Every clock in the city ticked louder these days, each beat a reminder that Britain was still alive, though barely. Convoys crept through the Atlantic under constant threat. The ration books grew thinner, and yet, somewhere behind a ring of barbed wire in Buckinghamshire, a different tide had begun to rise. Bletchley Park had changed. What had once been a quiet estate now pulsed like a living machine. Rows of wooden huts had multiplied across the lawns, their walls stained with damp and secrecy. Inside them, thousands of men and women bent over typewriters and decoding sheets, working in shifts that erased the distinction between day and night. The mansion's great hall, once filled with laughter and chandeliers, had become an administrative artery. The clock on its wall, patient and exact, kept a rhythm no bomb could interrupt. The victory of that single decrypted message in May 1941 had lit a spark. Turing's bomb had proven Enigma could be beaten. But to stay ahead of the enemy, the park had to grow faster, larger, more precise. The Germans changed their keys every 24 hours, sometimes even midday. Every morning at midnight, the clock at Bletchley reset not only its hands, but its challenge. The race began anew. Alan Turing, now officially the head of Hut 8, rarely left his post. His thin frame moved restlessly between tables, covered with rotor diagrams and notebooks filled with logic sequences. He spoke little, but his concentration was magnetic. He lived in minutes, not hours. Each tick of the clock meant another possible setting lost to time. When exhaustion blurred his vision, he would stand and pace, counting the seconds until the next idea surfaced. Yet Turing was not alone anymore. Hut 8 was alive with new recruits: linguists, mathematicians, crossword champions, chess prodigies, and members of the Women's Royal Naval Service who operated the bombs with surgical precision. They worked in teams, passing paper, plugging cables, recalculating rotor orders. Some barely knew what the others were doing. Secrecy was the rule. Every person held a fragment, never the full truth. That ignorance was its own defense. From the north of Scotland to the coasts of Cornwall, Britain's radio intercept stations, the Y service, fed Bletchley an endless stream of captured signals. They arrived by motorcycle courier, sealed in brown envelopes marked "Most Secret." Each one carried the sound of a German voice turned into static, a sentence transformed into symbols. They arrived faster than anyone could process. It was as if the air itself had become crowded with whispers. The first miracle of 1941 was not that Enigma messages were read. It was that they were read in time to matter. When the decrypted reports began to reach Whitehall, disbelief gave way to awe. Positions of U-boats, orders for air raids, troop timetables in North Africa. The British War Cabinet could now see them before they happened. The impact was immediate. Convoys altered course at the last hour and survived. RAF squadrons intercepted bombers already on their way. What had looked like clairvoyance was, in truth, mathematics. The intelligence carried a new classification: ultra. Only a handful of officers were told what it meant. Even Churchill himself received summaries stripped of detail. He called it, privately, the golden goose that never cackles. He understood that secrecy was the price of power. If Germany suspected its codes were broken, the miracle would end in a day. Thus began the double life of Ultra. Information gleaned from Enigma had to be disguised before it was used. When a destroyer captain suddenly found his ship in the perfect place to ambush a U-boat, he was told it came from air reconnaissance. When RAF fighters intercepted a formation of bombers in the dark, their accuracy was credited to luck. The clock at Bletchley marked the moments of triumph, but the world beyond was never allowed to celebrate them. Not everyone could bear that silence. Some codebreakers struggled with the weight of unseen victories. To know a ship was doomed and be forbidden to warn it because revealing knowledge might cost many more tomorrow. The moral tension hung as thick as the cigarette smoke. The ticking clock became not only a symbol of urgency, but of conscience. Each beat asked the same question: how much truth can we hide to preserve the greater good? In Berlin, the illusion of invulnerability endured. Reports of Allied luck reached the German Admiralty, but arrogance blinded them. Their faith in Enigma was absolute. To doubt it was to doubt German genius itself. One officer dismissed the rumors with a smile. They cannot break what they cannot even imagine. So the Reich continued to speak into the ether, and Bletchley continued to listen. By the summer of 1941, Ultra had already begun to alter the course of the Atlantic. The once terrifying wolf packs of U-boats found their prey disappearing. Convoys began arriving safely in Liverpool docks. Some captains joked that Neptune himself had switched sides. They never guessed that their guardian angels were men and women hunched over cipher tables 100 miles from London. The success brought growth. New huts were erected almost weekly. The park became a labyrinth of corridors and code rooms. Cables ran through windows. Bicycles lined the paths. Typewriters clattered without pause. The cafeteria served tea around the clock. The clock itself, that ever-present metronome, was now the unofficial overseer of all operations. Shift changes, meal breaks, and message deadlines were synchronized to its hands. In a place where no one could speak freely, it was the one voice allowed to be heard. Turing's machine count expanded too. By autumn, Over a dozen bombs were operating across Britain, their rhythmic spin echoing in distant factories. The war of metal against metal had found a new front, steel gears against steel hulls. Through Ultra, the British learned of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's coming assault on the Soviet Union. They learned of Italy's plans in North Africa and of new radar systems being tested along the French coast. For the first time since 1939, intelligence outpaced fear, and with every success, Bletchley Park grew quieter, more intense, as if conscious that its strength depended entirely on being unseen. One evening, as a storm rolled over Buckinghamshire, a group of young analysts paused their work to listen to the thunder. The power flickered. The clock in the hall stopped for a second, then resumed. Someone remarked that even time had learned to keep their secret. The moment passed, but the memory stayed. They all knew that if the clock ever truly stopped, if Enigma changed beyond their reach, the sea would once again fill with fire. By December 1941, the United States had entered the war. New machines, new personnel, and new energy flooded into the Allied effort. But it was Britain's hidden clockwork of codebreakers that had kept the island alive long enough to see that day. The tide of intelligence was now a river, feeding every Allied command theater. What began as a desperate experiment had become the greatest secret of the war. When Turing left his office that Christmas Eve, he walked past the Great Hall. The mansion was dark except for the faint glow of the clock's brass face. It read just after midnight. He stopped for a moment, listening to the tick echo through the corridors. So much depended on those seconds. Each one a life, a decision, a future. He thought of the ships crossing the Atlantic under that invisible protection, of the countless lives saved by information no one could ever acknowledge. The clock did not care. It simply moved forward, impartial and eternal, as it always had. But to those who served beneath its sound, that steady pulse had come to mean something profound. It was not only the heartbeat of Bletchley Park, it was proof that even in a world losing faith, time could still be mastered by thought. And so Ultra was born. A secret intelligence, a miracle of patience, a weapon forged not of power, but of precision. It would remain hidden for decades, but from this moment onward, the rhythm of the war would change forever. The clock kept ticking, and with each beat, the Allies moved one step closer to turning the tide. Late 1942, Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. By the winter of 1942, the war had consumed everything. Every nation, every life, every waking hour. Across the world, time itself had become a weapon. And nowhere was that more literal than inside the wooden huts of Bletchley Park, where the tick of a clock was not a comfort, but a command. The estate, once quiet and green, had become a world unto itself. Bicycles crowded the gates, soldiers checked papers in the snow, and the mansion's hallways pulsed with urgency. Huts now stretched into the fields, rows of timber boxes linked by narrow gravel paths, their windows covered in blackout cloth. From the air, the Germans might have seen nothing more than a sleepy English village. But on the ground, it throbbed with the hum of machines and the rustle of paper. Within these huts worked thousands, mathematicians, translators, typists, engineers, and a new army of women whose arrival changed everything. They came quietly, summoned by mysterious letters that promised only vital work for the war effort. Most were barely in their 20s, many just out of university or finishing school. Some had studied mathematics or physics. Others came from clerical work or teaching. They were known as the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, and their role was to operate the bombs. The bombs were now legion. Row upon row of tall, humming machines filled entire halls, their drums spinning endlessly through the night. Each bombe searched for the day's Enigma settings by eliminating impossibilities. Millions of them every minute. To keep them running required discipline, precision, and endurance. That became the work of the Wrens. Inside the bomb rooms, the air was always hot. The machines generated constant warmth, and the women worked in shifts, 8 hours on, 8 hours off, without pause. They moved like clock hands themselves, checking circuits, recording printouts, restarting engines when a fuse blew. Every movement was synchronized, every mistake unthinkable. Outside, the war raged unseen. But inside, the only battle was against time. Every minute mattered. Every tick of the clock meant another U-boat on the move, another convoy in danger. When the hands of the wall clock approached midnight, tension filled the air. At that moment, the Germans would change their Enigma keys again, resetting the code, erasing a day's progress. The women knew that sound too well. The long tick before the chime, marking the end of one race and the beginning of the next. Some of them found meaning in that rhythm. Others found exhaustion. They rarely saw daylight. Shifts blurred into one another. Tea breaks became rituals of survival. To laugh was to stay human. Joan Clarke, the only female cryptanalyst working directly with Alan Turing in Hut 8, was a quiet presence among them. Her mind worked like his, fast, analytical, instinctive. She could see through Enigma's patterns as if tracing light through fog. Yet even she was constrained by secrecy. Few in the park knew her name. Fewer knew her role. Like the clock, she kept time without recognition. The Wrens respected her in the way workers respect the engineer who understands the engine. She spoke little, worked steadily, and believed, like Turing, that the rhythm of the machines mirrored something deeper, the logic of persistence. Every morning, a lorry arrived from the Y service stations, carrying new bundles of intercepted messages, thousands of letters, dozens of frequencies, each one urgent. The envelopes were stamped, "Top Secret, to be opened immediately." The couriers never lingered. The packets vanished into Hut 6 and Hut 8, where analysts began decoding sequences, searching for cribs, guessed words that might align with German habits. Heil Hitler. Wetterbericht. Keine besonderen Ereignisse. No special events. Such phrases became the tiny handholds by which they climbed the wall of impossibility. When the analysts found a promising crib, they prepared the bomb for a run. The Wrens plugged cables, adjusted rotors, and flipped the master switch. The room filled with the hum of motion, hundreds of rotors spinning in perfect unison like a giant metallic heart. Then they waited, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. When the machine slowed, everyone fell silent. If the drums stopped in alignment, it meant one thing: a break, a breakthrough. That moment, the stillness before the printout, the realization that they had found the key, was sacred. It meant that, somewhere out at sea, a convoy might survive the night. It meant that an ambush would fail, that lives would be spared, that the balance of the war had tilted slightly toward hope, but they could tell no one. When their shifts ended, they left the huts in silence. Not even the men who courted them at the village pub knew where they worked. A simple question like, "What do you do?" became an unanswerable riddle. They called it the burden of silence. Even among themselves, they rarely spoke of the bigger picture. Compartmentalization kept them safe and ignorant. The girl in Hut 11 might never know that her night's labor had helped win a naval battle 1,000 miles away. But each one understood the ticking of the clock. Each knew that her work, unseen and uncredited, had value measured only in seconds saved and lives not lost. As the months passed, the machines grew faster, the staff more efficient. Bletchley Park became a rhythm unto itself. Breakfast at dawn, decryption by noon, results by midnight, new intercepts by morning. The clock at the mansion hall presided over it all, its brass pendulum swinging with the calm authority of inevitability. Sometimes, during rare quiet hours, The women would stand by the window and watch the dawn spread across the fields. They spoke of home, of music, of a world waiting for peace. Then the bell would sound, and the shift would begin again. In London, the newspapers spoke of victories at sea. U-boat losses increase. Convoy arrives safely. The public celebrated courage and leadership. No one mentioned the women of Bletchley Park. Their names remained secret, their courage invisible. But the results were undeniable. By late 1942, the Allies had regained control of the Atlantic. Convoy losses had fallen by half. The once invincible wolf packs were scattered and confused. The invisible clockwork of Bletchley Park was working perfectly, even as the people inside it began to blur into its motion. The irony was sharp. Those who worked most intimately with time had lost all sense of it. Days vanished, seasons blurred, youth slipped away. When one young Warren asked her superior when she might return home, the answer came softly, "When the clock stops." But of course, it never did. By the end of 1942, more than 7,000 women served at Bletchley Park. They typed, calculated, translated, repaired, and reasoned. Their labor, though largely unacknowledged, kept the entire intelligence machine alive. Without them, Ultra would have been impossible. When they walked the gravel paths between the huts at night, the air was filled with low vibration, the endless hum of bombs turning in darkened rooms. The sound blended with the steady tick of clocks in every corridor, a mechanical lullaby for an empire of thought. They did not know it then, but their quiet hands were reshaping the war. Their patience and precision were building the foundation of a future defined by information, a world where knowledge, not firepower, would determine victory. And though their names would remain hidden for decades, the rhythm they kept, the ticking clock, the pulse of persistence, would echo through history long after the guns had fallen silent. December 1943. Bletchley Park and Berlin winter returned to England heavy and gray. The trees around Bletchley Park stood bare, their branches etched against the white morning sky. Frost coated the gravel paths, crunching under the boots of workers hurrying between huts. Inside, steam rose from the radiators and breath lingered in the air. The great clock in the mansion hall still ticked, each beat measuring another fragment of a war that seemed endless. By the end of 1943, the world had changed. The Allies were no longer fighting for survival. They were preparing to strike back. The Americans had arrived, bringing men, machines, and confidence. The Germans, though still fierce, were stretched thin. Yet in one field of battle, the war remained dangerously balanced, the war of signals. Enigma was not alone anymore. Somewhere deep inside Germany, a new cipher had been born. It was called Lorenz, a monstrous evolution of secrecy, designed for the highest commands of the Reich. Unlike Enigma, it did not protect tactical orders or U-boat routes. It guarded the voice of the Führer himself. When Hitler sent messages to his generals, Lorenz carried his words through the ether in encrypted streams of electrical pulses. To the German mind, this was perfection reborn. If Enigma was a fortress, Lorenz was a citadel inside it, an invention so complex that even its operators barely understood its workings. Its wheels, circuits, and switches produced billions of combinations. Breaking it seemed beyond reason. But at Bletchley Park, reason was the one weapon that never ran out of ammunition. The Lorenz messages were first intercepted by accident in 1941 by British wireless operators at a station in Kent. They noticed a peculiar rhythm in the transmissions, longer, faster, more intricate than Enigma. The data was recorded on paper tape, rows of tiny holes punched through white strips like patterns in lace. These tapes were sent to Bletchley, where they sat unnoticed for months, waiting for someone to see what others had missed. That someone was Bill Tutte, a quiet, unassuming mathematician from Cambridge. He was 24 years old and disliked attention. But his gift for abstract reasoning bordered on genius. He studied the tapes and began to map their logic without ever having seen the machine that produced them. What he achieved was a kind of reverse engineering of the mind. Through pure deduction, he described the inner structure of Lorenz, the number of wheels, their order, their function. It was an intellectual feat as great as discovering a planet by studying its shadow. But understanding Lorenz was only half the battle. To break it, they needed a machine faster than thought. The bombs, with their mechanical rotors, were too slow. Paper and pencils were too weak. The clock at Bletchley ticked mercilessly, demanding a new kind of mind, one made not of flesh, but of valves and circuits. From this necessity emerged Colossus. It began as an idea in the mind of Tommy Flowers, an engineer from the British Post Office Research Station. He proposed building an electronic computer, something that could read the Lorenz tapes automatically and test thousands of logical patterns per second. His colleagues doubted him. The War Office hesitated. The cost was immense, and the concept too radical. But Flowers persisted, convinced that time itself could only be conquered by electricity. By December 1943, Colossus was ready. 10 feet tall, humming with the light of 2,500 vacuum tubes, it filled an entire room at Bletchley Park's Block H. When switched on, its glow bathed the walls in gold. Paper tapes flew through its readers at 50 feet per second, flickering like the wings of a trapped bird. It was alive, not in the human sense, but in rhythm, movement, and sound. When Colossus began to work, it was as though the park itself had changed tempo. The clock in the mansion hall continued its patient beat, but Colossus moved faster, thousands of ticks per second. For the first time, human intelligence had built something that could outrun its own creator. With Colossus decoding Lorenz, the highest secrets of the German High Command began to flow in. The Allies now saw not just operations but intentions. They could read the plans of generals, the doubts of ministers, even the Führer's anger. The scope of knowledge was terrifying. This was the birth of strategic omniscience, knowing the enemy's mind before the enemy acted. And with such knowledge came the heaviest burden: how to use it without revealing that they possessed it. The answers decrypted by Colossus were marked ultra top secret, and their circulation was so limited that many commanders never knew why orders changed. A convoy might be rerouted for no clear reason, a bombing target altered without explanation. Those who obeyed simply trusted that someone, somewhere, knew the clock better than they did. The German leadership, meanwhile, still believed in its own perfection. Lorenz was treated as sacred. It connected Hitler's headquarters to his generals in the field, transmitting discussions of invasions, retreats, and production plans. It was through these decrypts that Bletchley learned of the crumbling morale in occupied France, the depletion of German fuel reserves, and the growing strain of the Eastern Front. But Colossus's greatest contribution came in the months before the invasion of Western Europe. As 1944 began, the Allied command prepared for the most ambitious operation in history, the cross-channel assault that would become D-Day. Success depended on secrecy. The Germans had fortified the coast of France with bunkers, guns, and mines. They expected an invasion, but not where or when. Through Lorenz decrypts, Bletchley Park discovered that Hitler believed the main attack would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. The Allies decided to turn that belief into certainty. Using fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and a phantom army led by General Patton, they built an illusion: Operation Fortitude. The deception was total. Colossus confirmed that German intelligence swallowed the bait. Orders intercepted from Berlin showed that reinforcements were held back at Calais, while Normandy remained thinly defended. When the real invasion began on June 6, 1944, the success of D-Day was not written only on the beaches. It was written in the wires of Bletchley Park. The men who stormed, Ashore never knew that their enemy had been misled by a conversation deciphered months before. They never heard the ticking of the clock that had guided them there. After D-Day, the tide of war turned irreversibly. German supply lines collapsed, U-boats lost coordination, and the Luftwaffe fell silent in confusion. Each decrypted Lorenz message was a window into a dying empire. By late 1944, 10 Colossus machines were running day and night, devouring streams of data. The war had entered an age of electricity, a preview of the digital future. Those who worked with Colossus sensed it, even if they couldn't articulate it. They felt that they were standing at the edge of something vast, something beyond war, a new way of thinking. And still, the mansion clock ticked on. It measured not just the hours of battle, but the birth of a new era, an age where human reason, aided by machines, could turn chaos into clarity. When Hitler's final broadcasts came through in the spring of 1945, they were desperate, fragmented, filled with denial. Colossus read them without emotion. The machine had no hate, no pride, no fear, only logic. In the quiet huts of Bletchley Park, the war was ending not with gunfire, but with the whirring of reels and the calm voice of data made visible. The clock still marked the seconds, but now they belonged to peace. Colossus had done more than help win the war. It had taught the world that the future would speak in code, and that the key to survival would always be time. The ticking clock, once a symbol of urgency, now sounded like prophecy. Human hands had built something that could keep up with it. And in that moment, as the last winter of war gave way to spring, the world crossed quietly into the age of computation, guided by patience, intellect, and the unending rhythm of the clock. August 1945, Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The war ended quietly at Bletchley Park. There were no parades, no speeches, no crowds cheering in the streets, only a stillness that seemed unfamiliar, almost unnatural, after 6 relentless years of motion. In the summer of 1945, the world celebrated victory. Across London, church bells rang, fireworks lit the sky, and soldiers embraced strangers in the streets. But inside the high fences of Bletchley Park, there was only the faint creak of doors and the final winding of clocks. For those who had fought the war of silence, peace arrived not as joy, but as emptiness. Orders came swiftly. Destroy everything. The bombs, the intercept logs, the wiring diagrams, the decoding sheets, all of it was to be dismantled or burned. In the courtyards, workers stacked papers in tall heaps, watching as the flames consumed years of brilliance. The machines that had saved nations were reduced to metal frames and ashes. Even the mighty Colossus, the most advanced computer in existence, was taken apart piece by piece. They were told it was necessary. The technology must remain secret, the knowledge too powerful to share. But to those who had built these machines, who had lived by their rhythms, it felt like an unspoken burial. Alan Turing watched the dismantling with quiet detachment. For years, he had lived inside a world of logic and noise, where time was measured by the turning of rotors and the hum of circuits. Now the sound had vanished. Only the mansion clock remained, its patient rhythm echoing through rooms stripped bare. It struck him that time itself seemed to mourn. The war was over, but the purpose that had filled every second was gone. In August, the staff began to leave in waves. The Wrens packed their uniforms into suitcases and boarded trains back to London, Liverpool, Glasgow. Mathematicians returned to their universities, linguists to their classrooms. Some had spent so long in secrecy that ordinary conversation felt foreign. Others never spoke of it again. Every worker signed the official Secrets Act, a promise that what they had done here would remain untold, not for years, but for life. And so they carried their silence home, like invisible medals. In village pubs, questions were asked. What was it you did during the war? The answers were evasive, just office work. Few pressed further. Britain was full of secrets now. The irony was sharp. The very people who had seen the most, who had known the thoughts of the enemy before he spoke them, were now forbidden to speak at all. Their war would remain hidden, their triumph unacknowledged. Bletchley Park itself began to decay. Without its constant motion, the estate felt hollow. The huts grew cold, their walls sweating with damp. Weeds pushed through the gravel paths once trodden by thousands of hurried feet. The mansion stood silent, its clock still ticking. The last voice of a vanished army. Yet time, that old enemy, remained undefeated. Years passed. The world moved forward. Alan Turing continued his work quietly. He joined the National Physical Laboratory, designing new computers based on what Colossus had hinted at. Machines that could think, reason, and perhaps, one day, feel. But the world was not ready for him. His ideas were too strange, his life too private, his differences too visible in a society that demanded conformity. In 1952, a court condemned him under laws that treated his humanity as a crime. He lost his security clearance, his position, his dignity. The man who had helped shorten the war by years died in silence, still bound by the oath that forbade him to speak of what he had achieved. When the news of his death reached those who had known him at Bletchley, most could not even explain why they mourned. The secrecy still held. The clock kept ticking. It would be decades before the truth began to surface. Only in the 1970s did the files start to open, and the world learned what had happened inside that small estate of wooden huts and weary minds. Historians uncovered the scale of the operation, the 11,000 people who worked there, the millions of messages decrypted, the untold lives saved. Mathematicians described Turing's machines, engineers recalled the glow of Colossus, and the women of the Lorenz finally told their stories of sleepless nights and unheralded labor. The revelation astonished the world. What had been dismissed as rumor or myth became fact. That the outcome of World War II had been shaped not only by armies or generals, but by the quiet persistence of those who had fought with thought instead of fire. It also revealed something deeper, that the war's greatest moral victory had been won in silence. In a century defined by destruction, the defenders of Bletchley Park had built, not destroyed. They had proven that intellect and cooperation could overcome brutality, and that in the end, freedom itself depends not just on courage, but on understanding. Today, the mansion stands restored, its halls filled with exhibits and visitors. The huts smell of polished wood instead of ink. The great clock in the entrance still works, its pendulum swinging with the same deliberate rhythm it kept during the war. Tourists photograph it without realizing its significance. To them, it's a relic, a detail in the background. But to those who once lived by its sound, it was everything. It marked beginnings and endings, successes and failures, life and death. It was the pulse of purpose, a reminder that time, once lost, could never be regained, and that every second mattered. The ticking clock remains the symbol of Bletchley Park, the heartbeat of logic against chaos, reason against tyranny. For all the codebreakers, mathematicians, engineers, and Lorenz who passed through those gates, that sound never truly faded. Even years later, in ordinary lives scattered across quiet towns, many swore they could still hear it. The soft, insistent rhythm of the war that was never fought with weapons. When the official histories were finally written, the numbers astonished scholars. Intelligence from Bletchley Park, they estimated, shortened the war by at least 2 to 4 years, saving millions of lives. It reshaped modern warfare, founded the principles of computing, and defined the ethical limits of secrecy. But for those who had been there, it was never about statistics. It was about time. the one enemy they could never fully defeat, but always outthink. And so, as the last veterans of that invisible war passed into memory, one truth remained clear. Their struggle had not been only for victory, but for meaning, for proof that the human mind, when free, can transform even the darkest crisis into light. The ticking clock at Bletchley Park continues to measure that legacy. Its hands move across faces old and new. Its pendulum swings over a world shaped by the people who once listened to it. It no longer counts down toward invasion or despair. It marks the steady rhythm of peace. A peace bought not with noise, but with silence, intellect, and resolve. And if you stand beneath that clock today, you can still feel its message in the air, that every second is a choice, between ignorance and understanding, between fear and courage, between darkness and light. The war of machines has ended, but the war for truth, for clarity, for knowledge, for wisdom, continues. And somewhere, in that quiet hall where the clock ticks on, the echo of Bletchley Park reminds us that freedom will always depend on the people who dare to listen to time and answer it.